Dr. Howard Garber here for the ACRU. That's the American Civil Responsibilities Union, incorporated here in California. And today's discussion is going to be primarily on the criminal justice issues here in California. And we have, again, because they've both been on several times before, John Mancino, a board member and the head of our Criminal Justice Committee, and Carl Perlston. You were on last week. Carl, thank you for coming all the way from Torrance, is it?
My pleasure, Howard.
And you just got back from Florida?
Right.
You were there yesterday, I guess. Or the day.
Right, I was there for the weekend.
I see. Yeah, I was telling Carl before the program, I don't know too many people that have traveled around more than you. I mean, you are here, there, and everywhere. Thank you both for coming down, and let's get right into the subject. If we have enough time, we'll let's say deal with more than just criminal justice, but societal problems that relate directly or indirectly to crime. Let's say the causation. John, I might mention for the benefit of the audience, you look too young to have gone back to the early 80s, where you were an activist at that time dealing with criminal justice matters. You organized Citizens for Truth, and well, you describe how you got involved in keeping the members of the Manson gang incarcerated, etc.
Well, we first started out with a case of Sirhan, the convicted assassin of Robert Kennedy. In about a month and a half, we gathered some 12,000 petition signatures, notified the news media, attended a parole board executive hearing, and presented our petitions and demanded that his parole date be rescinded. And he was actually granted a release date in his first parole hearing. Imagine, this is the guy who shot probably the next president of the United States, and he was granted a parole date, his very first parole hearing.
And at that time, that's when I met you and got involved with Citizens for Truth.
Right, and so then we went on to the infamous Onion Field case. The daughter of the slain police officer, Ian Campbell, his daughter, Valerie Campbell, contacted us. In about 3.5 weeks, we gathered 31,500 petitions and several thousand letters. And we were successful in getting both Sirhan's and Gregory Powell's parole dates rescinded.
You were on radio and TV with victims of crime. You were pioneering the idea of let the public see what these people have gone through.
Sure, exactly. And what was going on was that, and the public was unaware, that 37% of the life inmates, and you're talking about thousands and thousands of inmates, that come up at the time were coming up for a parole hearing every single year. And 37% of them were being found suitable for release on an annual basis. Well, after we got involved, within 2 years, that dropped to 3%. So it was a significant drop. And the public was unaware that people like Gregory Powell were actually being granted parole dates. And Jimmy Lee Smith, his accomplice in the Onion Field case, was actually paroled back in 7 times.
You and I and an attorney, 2 attorneys, I guess, went up to San Francisco. We were on, it might have been national radio and TV, dealing with that very issue.
It went all the way to the state Supreme Court.
We used the media to our advantage, going right into the Rosebird recall, but let's, we could spend the whole hour on that. But Carl, what is your general feeling about, we were discussing this before the program, the idea that Governor, as an example, Governor Ryan of Illinois had come here, I think it was, and he was going around the nation trying to let but he proposes a moratorium on the death penalty. And here we have California with the so-called death penalty having only 13 executions in 40 years. Since 1963, 13 executions, which ACRU has called a, let's say, blockage of the death penalty, if you will, or a de facto moratorium.
Sure.
That's what it is. What is your thoughts?
Well,
What are your thoughts?
it's a vindication of what the opponents of capital punishment have been doing all along. They set out to eliminate capital punishment in the United States, and they finally got the Supreme Court to announce that capital punishment was unconstitutional the way that it was being carried out. And so they said, okay, capital punishment is dead. Then
That was 1972 when they overturned it.
Yeah, then the Supreme Court came back and said, okay, all you got to do is reconstitute the way you do it, and capital punishment is not barred by the U.S. Constitution. And so all the capital punishment people were, very dejected, and they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll make it impossible to execute anybody. And that's been the campaign that's gone on very successfully.
Who is to blame for this? It's more than a stalemate, for what I call judicial blockage of the death penalty in California and in other states.
Well,
who do we point the finger at?
Well, you can point the finger at, for one thing, you can point it at people who refuse to permit executions to take place and who will utilize every legal maneuver to continually keep the person alive on death row by letting him sit there for 20 years, going through appeal after appeal after appeal. You can point to the judges in the system.
Are you talking about the Ninth Circuit?
I'm talking about judges in the state and in the federal system who are opposed to capital punishment and who therefore will permit the judicial process to be utilized to block any executions.
As an attorney, were you involved yourself in prosecutions, or?
I was always a defense attorney.
You're always, well, unless you're working for the DA
That's
or
right.
AG, you're going to be a
That's
defense
why
attorney.
I always liked the English system, where you had an opportunity to work on the prosecution side. But if you can string out a capital punishment, the execution, you can string it out for 20 or 30 years. That's the equivalent of not having capital punishment. And that's been what's going on. When Governor Ryan just gives a moratorium to how many prisoners? It was an astonishing number of people. And he just said, I'm not satisfied that they're all really guilty or that they're not really innocent, even though they've been found guilty by a court. That perverts the entire criminal justice system, and it is an effective elimination of capital punishment. And that's exactly what we have.
Governor Ryan got the idea from someone else in New Mexico.
Absolutely, and it wasn't the first time the governor of New Mexico, and right after the 1986 November 1986 election, he was booted out of office. So he says in his last one fell swoop of action, empty death row.
He commuted the sentence
of every single.
Right.
Now, they didn't have life without parole, so every one of them became eligible for parole immediately.
Isn't that
And I would rather lay the majority of the blame at the foot of the voters, not only in California but across this country. Because you look at what happened in 1972 after the Supreme Court abolished capital punishment, the voters overwhelmingly put it back into place. Same thing in 1977.
Right.
After the 1976 ruling to abolish the death penalty. But those same voters don't seem to understand what they're doing when they go to the polling places and elect governors and presidents. The governors and presidents in this country are the ones that put those judges on the bench, and the public doesn't get it. How can the same public that votes overwhelmingly for capital punishment and life in prison to mean life in prison elect public officials who don't believe the same language? And life doesn't mean life, and death really doesn't mean death. The public is at fault here as well.
Well, the public goes in the ballot box, makes its vote, and figures that takes care of the matter.
It doesn't.
And as you say, it doesn't, because the people who are in charge, the people in the executive, the people in the legislative, really don't have all that much respect for what the public does. They figure the public goes to the polls and that's it. Now, get away, And,
Right, but we
and
can't
we'll
forget-
do,
we
we'll
can't
do what we
forget
think
that-
is right.
And the public adapts to this situation
Absolutely.
The public
They
as
accepts
accept
if
it.
this kind of treatment
right.
is inevitable and there's nothing they can do
That's
about
right,
it.
the public
So
just
it's a
gives up.
defeatist attitude on the
That's
part
right.
of the public,
But yet they keep
you have to
electing the same
understand.
officials. They keep electing the same public officials who don't believe the
Well,
way they
right
do.
now, many are saying it's the lesser of two evils.
Let me-
They really don't want to vote for
me share
either
some-
party.
Well, you know,
Let me share
an
some,
example, just it's attitudinal. Our local bar association, where I come from in Torrance, the president is retiring after the end of the year, and so she writes a little thing about how the bad things, and then she writes about the good things, and she writes about you know, how there were commutations of capital punishment. She writes about how the Massachusetts Supreme Court endorses gay marriage, and she thinks all these are good things. These attitudes permeate the judicial system, permeate the legal system. By and large, trial lawyers are not conservative. By and large,
They're defense-oriented. We are prosecution-oriented.
Correct. Let me share some statistics with you just on the issue of parole. In 1986, in early 1986, I was involved in a study with the Department of Justice that said in California at the time, 55% of the of all male felons released from California prisons returned within the first 5 years, 55% of them. Tell you what's happened now, we have 70% of the state's paroled felons reoffend within 18 months. So it's gone from 55% to 70%, and in only 18 months. So less than 2 years. You're talking a year and a half, they're returning.
And how many
it's
of these?
outrageous.
How many of these parolees that are out there are lost in the system? You can't even locate them.
29% of them are violent incorrigibles. 29%. So you take rape, for example. 70% of the rapes in California are perpetrated by repeaters, recidivists, those who have been in and out of the system for rape already.
how do you contrast the state system where we have parole, which doesn't seem to work, and the federal system, which Congress finally said, let's get rid of parole?
Well, you know, you can look at the federal system by comparison, and you know, 32% at the federal level of the parolees from the federal prisons are returned. They're returned at a higher rate than the state of
Well, you
California.
said the federal doesn't provide for parole. There's a conflict there.
The federal government, for crimes committed after a particular date,
Right.
no more parole.
That's
but you
right.
still have people paroled for crimes that were committed earlier.
Absolutely,
But
and there's still
Congress-
people being paroled because it wasn't made retroactive.
Yeah, right.
So everybody
But
who's
Congress-
incarcerated
but
still
Con-
gets a parole
yeah.
hearing.
But Congress looked at these recidivism rates and said, parole isn't working. It's not
Absolutely it's
accomplishing
not
what
working.
it's doing.
Your recidivism rates also cannot be thought of as reliable, because there are many individuals that have been incarcerated and then paroled, and they're out there free as a bird, committing their crimes, and in some areas over 60%, I think in LA it's above that, are, let's say, of the criminals that are wanted, are out there and they're not apprehended. So in other words, they are not found. A murder's been committed,
That's
a
right.
manslaughter, whatever.
52%
They don't
of
know
the
who did it.
homicides.
They
Absolutely.
don't know. Well, what makes you think that some of these parolees aren't committing these? They just
Absolutely.
haven't
Well,
been
no,
found
no.
again. So, and
You're-
those are not worked into your figures.
That's
there.
right. 52%
You're-
of the
figures
homicides are
you're
not-
dealing with are those that you know are
Right.
recidivists. The ones that are out there committing
right.
it. There are many unsolved crimes, and
Give me
but
that-
let's not talk about the fact that it's probably a good percentage, if not most
Well,
of
there
them.
are two things that
well-
there are two things that drive parole. One of them is financial, that it costs a lot of money to keep the people in prison, and therefore if you can get them out of prison, you save money. The other is the idea that you rehabilitate people, and that if they're rehabilitated, then why keep them in prison? So these two things.
Well, there's something that the public doesn't get, and certainly our public officials don't get. You've got offenders and you got violent offenders. The public doesn't want prisons built in their net backyards. We've got millions and millions of dollars that have been stacking up since 1982 to build prisons. Nobody wants a prison in their backyard. I got an answer. You take the violent offenders and you build, and the private industry does this, not the union organizations. Build a facility out in the middle of the desert. If it's good enough for our soldiers to serve in pup tents in the middle of the desert, it's good enough for these violent, incorrigible child molesters, rapists, murderers to be out there.
But also,
don't hire union employees, because that's the problem. That's what's holding up prisons out in the desert. Unions don't want to work out there. We'll put a private industry prison out there and house the violent offenders there. People don't care if they got a bad check titer living next door to them in a prison. They don't care about that. They care about their children being molested, their daughters being raped, their wives being raped, and their family members murdered.
But an important concern related to that is complete separation between violent offenders and nonviolent.
Absolutely.
In other words, a check forger, an embezzler, they're not dangerous to your health. Take my wallet, don't bash my skull in.
Absolutely.
And if we can't understand the distinction between violent crime and nonviolent crime, the nonviolent people can be put to work. They're not going to be bashing each other, killing each other. So when are we going to have this total separation and understand the distinction? One group can be put to work,
demands it from its public officials.
And their kind of penal institutions could almost, in Texas they have, in other states they have some of that, where the inmates will do painting and all kinds of other things.
We have a bit of that. We have Corcoran State Prison, the Pelican Bay, which is strictly for violent offenders.
We're finally getting some of that.
Well, we had it years ago, before the Jerry Brown administration. The Chino Hills prison that this Kevin Cooper escaped from, they had their own dairy. On-site dairy. They had their own
Chinos had
agricultural
violent
program.
and nonviolent and a mixture of things. So
and
it's
Jerry
not
Brown
all
eliminated all that and put the funds into rehabilitation programs, which have shown over the years to be a failed experiment.
He's the one that Jerry Brown came up with the idea of canceling the term, doing away with the term prison, and these are now correctional. And now you talk, you mentioned rehabilitation.
No, they used to be called penitentiaries, where you went to become penitent and express remorse.
But now they're corrections. Let's not use penitence.
Right.
Okay.
But
you mentioned, I think it was an important point about rehabilitation. It's got to be regarded as an experiment. Who is to state that after they serve their time, so-called time in prison, serving that time, and they're out, that they have been rehabilitated? It is an experiment conducted at the expense of this country. As far as I'm concerned, when it comes to parole and probation and this idea of rehabilitation, incorrigibles, and I'll even apply this to, and have your comments, to, not only to violent criminals, but to individuals who, some of them 25, 30 times in incarceration. When do we reach a point where the person is truly regarded as an incorrigible, either a violent incorrigible, or in the area of white-collar crime, an incorrigible that has to be completely, permanently separated from us for our benefit?
Well, the United States Congress decided that rehabilitation was a dead end and wasn't effective, and that's why they abolished parole. If you work with juvenile offenders, on the other hand, and I did a lot of work in defending juvenile delinquents, they are rehabilitatable if you catch them early enough.
Some of them.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the ones that are really the gangbangers and the murderers. Though I have seen murdering juveniles and raping juveniles, and even some of those can be reached if you get them young enough. But rehabilitation needs to be concentrated on those people who are rehabilitatable, and that's usually young people. Once you get past into adulthood and you start committing crimes, I think you ought to forget about the whole idea of parole, unless there are some exceptional circumstances, because people who are who get involved in a life of crime, by the time they're an adult, they're going to stay in that, as shown by the high recidivism rates.
Unfortunately, and let's hear your comment, our social scientists, the psychologists and the psychiatrists, who often are the ones that we listen to here, they analyze the situation and interview the person that's been incarcerated and come up with the idea that they seem to have been rehabilitated, and we go along with them. And most of them in this area of the social sciences are liberals. They, let's say, are enablers.
Well,
there, but for the sake of God, go I, or whatever,
Psychology is an art, not a science. Okay, that's the first issue. Secondly, you look at those who who are saying that these people are rehabilitated. We have no guarantee. We have Robert Massey, sentenced to death, overturned, eligible for parole, released, kills again, back on death row for new murder. Lavelle Frierson, same thing, sentenced to death for a murder, gets his sentence commuted, becomes eligible for parole, released, kills again. I mean, it happens over and over and over again, and as long, for example, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before 1983, that actually meant less time than a straight life sentence of 25 years to life. You could actually petition the governor and or the state Supreme Court for a commutation of your sentence to life with parole after 12.5 years. Well, with a straight life sentence, you had to serve a minimum of 16 years. So it's a joke, it's a farce. For every day served, you get a day off for this alleged good behavior. Well, you don't have to do anything to earn that. You just have to stay out of trouble and not get caught. So the whole system of parole needs to be, as far as I'm concerned, especially with violent incorrigibles, eliminated, period.
Right.
When somebody's sentenced to life without parole, it should mean life without parole, where governors like in New Mexico and like Governor Ryan cannot commute those sentences to something less.
John, we're far along in the program and we've talked about the problem. Let's talk about solutions, okay? Because as far as I'm concerned, we hear about tort reform and whether it's on a state level, whether the national government should get involved. How about reform in this area dealing with violent crime and violent offenders, especially the ones we call violent incorrigibles, at least as far as we're concerned. After so many crimes, they should be considered incorrigible. What is the solution in terms of reforms in that area? Because the United States is still the most murderous large nation in the world. We had, I don't know what the current figures are, but 10 times the violent crime and the murder and mayhem of Japan, 20 times it was 20 times Japan, 10 times was England, and things have changed since then. But this great free nation isn't one where you're free to walk the streets in relative safety.
No, it's
even
not.
Today, gang warfare. Let me hear about solutions.
Oh, I think one solution seems to me very common sense is to have a concealed carry permit. They have, shall carry. That people ought to be able to carry guns for their own protection, just like they can do in Florida and Arizona and Nevada.
Yeah, I agree with you to an extent, but I think that's a Band-Aid. I think the public needs to demand from its public officials. For example, Governor Schwarzenegger right now is talking about these early release programs.
Let's get into that. That's an amazing
thing. Right now in the paper Sunday, talking about early release programs for these repetitive criminals.
That's just to save money.
To save money. It's all about money. Well, you know what? I'd rather spend the money to keep them in than have them floating around my neighborhood.
We want to save lives.
Yeah, we want to save lives. Those lives are worth more than dollars as far as I'm concerned. And what we ought to do is force, if this is what he wants to do, force an element to be added to this proposal that separates violent from nonviolent felons. We put them out in the desert, and that's where they stay. There's no such thing as parole. Life means life, and nothing less. You cannot have your sentence commuted, you can't have it pardoned, and you can't go to the states or federal Supreme Court to have it commuted.
John, before the program was over, we were talking on the phone just the other day about the farce of life without the possibility of parole.
Absolutely, it's a farce. There are 38 states with the death penalty. There's 38 states that have life without parole. Not one single state out of those 38 does it mean life without parole. Well, it can either be, and in Oklahoma, they're having a hell of a time in Oklahoma right now because there are several inmates right now who have petitioned and have gotten the ear of the state Supreme Court there to have their sentences commuted to life with parole, and they'll immediately be eligible for release.
But the governor can commute the sentence. You've already discussed that.
Commute it, but the courts can also step in.
Can change.
Sure they can.
A legislature can change the whole thing in one fell swoop.
Absolutely.
How can they get by with this
1984,
without the possibility? That word possibility is...
It's
so difficult. Look at the U.S. Supreme Court continually overrules the Ninth Circuit, and yet the Ninth Circuit keeps on doing what it wants to do.
That's right. Look who loaded the Ninth Circuit.
No, well, when they just
Jimmy
had this,
Carter and Bill Clinton.
When they had this hearing on the Cooper matter, some of the judges said, "Look, we don't have any jurisdiction here. The Supreme Court has told us not to get involved in this
But
kind
they
of
did
case.
it anyway,
But they
didn't
did
they?
it anyway.
Sure they
You
did.
know, I don't know where we are along the program. This thing isn't working too well. But let me put it this way. In 72, there were 111 on death row. So when we're talking about life without the possibility of parole or the death penalty, the so-called death penalty, all 111 in one fell swoop were off the death row.
68
Okay.
more.
And then within 6 years, in 1976, 68 were then collected on death row. One fell swoop, they were off this farcical death row, okay? So it's about time the public understands there's no such thing as absolutes here, that it's life, they get the death penalty, which isn't a death penalty. Life without the possibility of parole, it's not life without the possibility of parole. 25 years to life doesn't mean even a minimum of 25 years. Very often they're out
12 and a half years.
That's right. So when are we going to stop this misrepresentation? When is the public going to face up to the fact that whether it's the criminal justice officials or politicians that are coming out with this propaganda, which is absolutely false? Your
Well,
comment.
I like your idea of putting them out in the desert, the violent offenders. You know, the Sheriff Armejo down in Phoenix, he runs his county jail in tents, and he doesn't have any color television. I don't think they even have coffee. He gives them bologna sandwiches. He treats them like prisoners, not entitled to all the amenities, and people don't want to come back there.
Talk about amenities. You got Charles Tex Watson, who has been married while he's been in prison.
Three
He's a guy
children.
who slashed Sharon Tate 56 times, hung her from a ceiling beam while she was alive, and tried to carve her baby from her womb. This guy has fathered 5 children, and those children and his wife are all on welfare.
It was 3 the last time I heard. Now it's 5.
Rhode Island prison, listen to talk about amenities. Rhode Island prison, inmates had an assembly room. They had large screen TV with video equipment. Somebody decided it'd be okay to bring porno films in. So they're watching porno films. One guy gets excited, grabs another guy. The guy doesn't want to be grabbed, and the fight ensues. So listen to this. There's a big fight that ensues. They remove all the video equipment, including the large screen TV. They file a class action lawsuit and win to get it back.
Oh, God.
That's what's wrong with
And how about the Texas
Absolutely.
Chainsaw Massacre being
Absolutely.
played in the various prisons, including Chino?
Yeah.
You and I.
Can you imagine that?
Yeah. Let me say this. During the Rose Bird era, we're going back to the 80s, it was Rose Elizabeth Bird's court. At that time, that when the subject of having prisons out in the desert for the violent offenders came up, she said that would make it difficult for friends and relatives of the inmates to visit them. And of course, we responded at that time, pointing out that we didn't give this kind of consideration to our military people that were out in the desert, making it difficult for friends and relatives to visit. What kind of a basic philosophy can they have where they will have more consideration?
It's excuse making. It's a smoke
It is.
screen.
And we were talking about psychologists and psychiatrists. I think psychiatrists and psychologists ought to analyze that kind of.
Well, we are being ruled by a cultural elite which has really contempt for the views and the culture of the people, of the common people. And in that cultural
Final
elite,
remarks.
Yeah, well, in that cultural elite, they have contempt for the death penalty. They think that it's barbaric, and they point to,
We call it judicial euthanasia. We're not interested in suffering on the part of anyone, including inmates. We want to terminate them humanely, okay? Euthanasia, I think, is a proper term.
Well, you talk about these folks. The latest polls show that 83% of the California voters supports the death penalty. You've got about 11 to 12% that are undecided. You got 5%, 6 tops, that are ruling this state's laws.
Right.
5 to 6% of the elite liberal leftists running this
I
state.
hear the music. You've heard it.
Absolutely right.
You've heard it. And let's carry this on another program, because I think we'll have to spend a lot more time dealing with solutions here. Dr. Howard Garber, thank you for tuning in. Check our website. Send us your emails. I'd like to hear from you. Gentlemen, again. Dr. Howard Garber here for the ACRU. That's the American Civil Responsibility Union. We're incorporated here in California, and often I'll mention how long we've been on the air here at Adelphia Cable TV. We will be going into our 8th year very soon, and so we've been on a long time weekly. We've covered a lot of subjects, a lot of issues, controversial issues for the most part, the kinds of issues that affect society. And today's show won't be any different. We're going to start off with the subject, as it's indicated on the schedule here, national issues related to immigration, legal and illegal. And we have Ron Winship. Ron, you've been here before, but it's been quite a while before the program. I was trying to place the time that you were here, but it was shortly after 9/11.
It was.
Yeah.
It certainly was.
And things were kind of up in the air at that time in terms of programming. We had to change our complete schedule because of what happened at that horrific time. And Ron, you're the producer of the Cutting Edge, which is an I don't know how to describe it, an internet interview program.
Yeah, they call it New Media Web Productions.
And I might mention that if you want to check that program out, it's www.cuttingedgetalkshow.com, and spelled just the way it is. www.cuttingedgetalkshow.com. Oh, I'm sorry. It's all
you
important.
you gotta get that little hyphen in there in the middle too.
It's on the screen, so you'll have the correct designation. atalkshow.com. Larry Gilbert.
Dr. Garber?
Larry, you've been on once before also.
Yes, I have been.
And I can't remember what we discussed that time, very frankly.
Might have been an overview of what we're doing with internet broadcasting.
And a little controversy there too, or was there?
There's never controversy on this program, is there?
Always.
I haven't experienced it anyway.
Yeah. Well, let's get right into it, because you guys have been involved in a lot of issues as we have here at ACRU. And as I was saying before the program, I'm hearing a lot of talking here. Before the program, we were saying that there are so many issues and sub-issues related to legal and illegal immigration, going back to, let's start with the Eisenhower administration, where we were first beginning to understand the nature of individuals coming over.
Dr. Garber, I think I did a little thinking about this before I came on the show today, and I think one of the things you got to think about is that immigration in this country has always been an issue. And when I say that, 3 potato famines in particular had tremendous impact on our immigration in this country. The German potato famine of 1850, the Swedish potato famine of 1870, the Irish potato famine of 1890, and so on. And so every time that we had people who needed jobs, who needed a place to live, who needed to increase their lifestyle, they came to this country, to the United States. And as a effect of that, reflecting that, in fact, a great number of Russians and Balkan Jews came right over here to the United States right at the turn of the century because of the same issues. They didn't have any place to eat in their own home countries, and they didn't have any place to go.
Well,
so, as a
those
result
are
of
causes, but I'm not so sure
but where I'm
that
going
the
with
issues that were created by that kind of population, by that kind of immigration in this country, because we were a new nation with lots of...
We've always been a new nation. I think we're even a new nation today.
Well, no, I'm talking about relatively compared to Europe and others that were established. And we have plenty of land here for development.
We had plenty of land, and
that's
we
what
had
I'm saying.
plenty of job
That's right.
availability.
In those days, the situation was quite different when they arrived here.
Right.
They weren't displacing workers. They were, in other words, pioneers.
We understand that, but I think people should understand the history of this. You know, Larry did a lot of research on Braceros and what happened in 1942 when we took a bunch of Japanese people and put them out on prison camps, okay, because they were a national security issue. And then we turned around and we brought in
Let's
Mexican
not get into
people.
one of my favorite issues.
Oh, I know that. I
went to Washington twice on that, and when you say they were incarcerated, there were three categories. On December 7th, 1941,
Exactly.
As of that time, the Attorney General's Office of the United States under FDR apprehended, incarcerated those they were Japanese aliens who became enemy aliens at the very time by international law and American law. I don't want to get into the whole subject. And they were confined in what would be tantamount to a prison camp. They were internment camps run by the Department of Justice, like Crystal City, Texas,
Absolutely.
and two others. Okay,
But
that is a sharp distinction between creating a red zone, a security zone on the West Coast. 44 states were totally unaffected,
Right.
but a German and Italian and Austrian and Japanese enemy aliens, because all the nationals became enemy aliens by international law and American law. So they had to go from an assembly center. They didn't have to go to a relocation center. They could have gone to any of the 44 states. Anyhow,
but that circles back to the point that I'm trying to make here, and the issue is really, every time that we get into a situation of war, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, all the way up to modern days, the Patriot Act, that's a full extension. Each time that we hit a wartime situation, we came into a different set of rules that governed the conduct of our immigration policies and our own conduct.
I see where you're coming from.
So my point is here.
Absolutely.
So my point is here that we had in 1942, as Larry dug up out of this stuff, all of our CERO program that lasted till 1964, where we brought people from Mexico, bring them here to do our crops.
Yeah, the term wetback came around during the Eisenhower administration. No, coming over the
Rio Grande
River, and that wetback name stuck. But things were pretty well under control.
But my point is that we have different. Each time in our history, we have different demands on our society, whether it's because of a national security war situation or because of the fact that people just want to come here because they want to eat.
Yeah,
now, in this particular case, we're in an interesting situation that that our president is having a tough time dealing with, and that is we've got all of these immigrants coming into our country, and we're at a time of war. So it's a real conundrum as to how to balance the reality between having, and as you've said so many times on this program, for years we've had immigrants coming into this country.
Well, I'm a first-generation American myself.
They're not following the law.
My folks waited in line to come here. Okay.
Right.
The point is, when you say immigrants, there are two varieties,
sure,
illegal and legal.
Right.
And let's talk about it, Larry. What is your particular view of the current situation and its implications, where we can't control our borders? Isn't that what it's all about?
Let me back up and say that my father came here from Europe, so I know what you're saying. He came through Ellis Island, but he came here legally, and he had to wait his turn. And there are millions of people that are in this country that are immigrants, but they came through and followed the procedures that are set up. We have now about 11 million illegals, according to the numbers I've seen.
That's a conservative figure.
Somewhere between 8 and 12 million, whatever the number is. It's interesting that we can find, when we have a mad cow disease concern, a cow that was born 3 years ago in Canada, and we find it on a farm in Washington, but we can't locate these illegals that are roaming all around the country. It's a big problem.
And it's ironic that we can't.
Everybody can point to the problem. The answer is, what is the solution? And part of the problem I see is a lack of enforcement. I spoke to an INS agent yesterday, and first, there's a morale problem there because of the change of names. They've got a high turnover rate right now. The average agent has only got about 3 years of experience. They're not happy with the changes that they're dealing with, but he was telling me they can go into a factory and check on the legitimacy of an employee. However, they cannot go onto a farmer's land. They've got to wait for those people that may be illegals to leave the farms before they can even apprehend them to question them. We have Operation Vanguard and the meatpacking plants up in Nebraska. And we were starting to check some of their records of the employees, and we found out that there were some questions we wanted to ask, and a lot of them were illegal and they ran off. So what happened is that these owners of these packing plants got upset. They went to their elected officials, including their governor, who went to their U.S. senator, to put pressure on the Department of Justice to stop INS because it was fouling up their, their operation. So I don't know that there's really a will to stop the problem, to deal with the problem.
As far as government's concerned,
as far as the government's concerned,
that isn't true as far as the population is concerned, because polls indicate that the public is essentially outraged that America can't control its
but
borders.
people don't know they don't know the details involved with this. The example that Larry drew about the farm workers, okay, the reason why the INS doesn't go onto farms and actually chase after people as they did in the 60s is because of Cesar Chavez and his farm workers union that said, you know what, if you're going to have to send the INS into California farms, take off these people out of the middle of the day while they're trying to work, even though they're illegal immigrants, then everybody on the whole team's going to strike. And they did this during the 60s. I mean, so that's the reason why there's such a strength in the farm workers union. So the INS is facing state problems. They're facing a lot of and the emotional side of this, I think, isn't really related as much as they want to. Recently, just yesterday, as a matter of fact, on TV, they show children 10, 11 years old that are trying to sneak into California to meet up with their parents. Well, this breaks everyone's heart. You know, they see little kids and they're sending these kids across alone, trying to tie up with their family members. Well, you know, I think the morality involved in this, all Americans want to do the best for their fellow man. They want to be helpful. And certainly they'd like to reunite kids with their parents. It would seem like a normal situation. But when those same parents have come into this country illegally and didn't even bother to take the time to even check in at the border, then we've got a problem that has now...
It is a law and order issue, but it's more than that. We're talking numbers right now, the numbers of people coming across, but I say that it's more than a quantitative problem. It is a qualitative problem. We're not getting the affluent from Mexico. We're not, I say Mexico because that's where the great numbers are coming from, but in some of the other South American countries, we're not getting the middle class from those countries. We are getting the impoverished dregs of those societies, okay?
But that's the same thing that they said during the German potato famine and the whole thing all the way back through our history. We didn't get the
truth of the matter is...
We didn't get the kings and queens of Europe to come over here and immigrate.
Well, wait a second. I'm telling you that the quality of the population coming here, if you're talking about ability, they are laboring types of individuals who, by statistics, do not do well academically. And
the federal numbers belie what you're saying. We've got H-1B visas that are bringing educated Chinese and Indians into this country.
I'm not talking about. The Asians have performed in an exemplary way. You go to UC Irvine, and a predominant number of students at Cal State universities and UC Irvine and Berkeley and the rest of them are Asians, okay, whether they're Chinese or Japanese. So, you know, if you want to get into the subject of the relationship between genetics and IQ, we can do that too.
Yeah, but Dr.
I don't
Garber,
want. We'll save that for another program.
This sounds a little bit racist here. You're saying, well, because these people are not educated, they're not allowed in the United States.
Let me ask you something. Now, there are a lot of books out, but one of the more recent ones, The Population Bomb, talks about, on a statistical basis, the relationship between genetics and race. Is that a racist publication? Don't confuse bigotry, which is irrational prejudice and irrational discrimination, with what you call racism. Racism, in my view, and in the view of many other individuals, can be simply defined as the simple acknowledgement of ethnic and racial differences. Now, how does that sound to you?
Well, I just think that the liberals, I'm taking the other side of this coin for a lot of reasons. There are a lot of people out there that probably feel that want to say this to you when you're on TV every week. But they don't want to. There's nobody here.
Are you talking about permissive liberals who tolerate the intolerable?
Well, maybe, but let's just say some partially bleeding hearts out there that might want to question some of your statements on the show sometimes. And all I'm going to say to you is this: every liberal educator in the state of California would tell you that you can take any child and make them a PhD in anything if you give them proper education and training.
Oh, that
now
is,
you and
that
I
is so
just
much
may
baloney.
disagree with
No,
that.
I disagree.
But
It's
the
an
point
absurd
is,
statement.
but the
You
point
take
is,
two
yeah.
dumb parents with 60 IQs, and their children will never be geniuses.
Well,
If
you're
they
gonna have
are,
to
it's a
hope for some
mutation.
DNA
Come on.
replacement here.
The fact is, we all know intelligent parents, by and large, have intelligent children. Not all the time, most of the time. Stupid parents with low intelligence usually have low IQ children. Not all the time, most of the time.
So
let's not argue it because
exactly. But
we'll
what
never
do you
get
say
anywhere.
to me now? You have to have an IQ test before you get in the United States?
Well, wait a second. Let me ask you this. Do you have a vocational test in many places before you get a job? You have to show your qualifications. So testing isn't that, let's say, unreasonable. How about university testing? Is it unreasonable that you have to pass a test, and if you don't, they say, sorry, you don't have it? Well, the person would say, that's discriminatory. Yes, it is discriminatory. We discriminate a lot based on persons' qualifications. So there are those kinds of considerations, and the people that were getting into the country today illegally, for the most part, not all of them, just most of them, wind up in menial jobs. They are filling our prisons. 25% of our jails and prisons are illegal aliens. The sociological and societal impact on it is horrendous. And we are adapting to these worsening conditions over a period of time. And frankly, this guy who was born in the 20s, yes, has seen drastic changes, and we're adapting to these increments of change. And California might as well be called an extension of Mexico.
Let's extrapolate that out. Let's say 10 years from now, Dr. G, do you think that our society is going to take in all of these immigrants, no matter how many that they bring across from Mexico?
I think you should be qualified to vote, very frankly, and I think you should be qualified to come into this country. I think a PhD from out of the country that wants to come in should be given preference. I think that this country could use more brains.
Dr. Garber, let me jump in here.
Yep.
A couple of years ago, talking about a guest worker program, President Fox said, by the year 2025, not only do we have open borders for trade, but he expects open borders for his people.
Well, he's a one-worlder.
So,
That's great.
So the point is, he's going to continue to push his people to come here and get jobs rather than working for $4 a day in Mexico. This is a land of opportunity here. And I would think that our
He wants to
president,
invade us. That's war.
it's exactly what he's doing.
Well,
He has no intention of stopping the flow. When we've got 2,000
and we
miles
should have
of border,
leadership that has no intention to permitting him to do it.
The issue is, though, that how do you protect your borders? And the correct way, of course, is that, you could shut them down. You could just shut down the borders.
Look, there's a 3-mile section of fence to be completed here in
Right.
San
And they won't fund it.
Isidro.
They won't fund it.
And it's the California, what is the name of the commission
the Coastal
the
Commission?
Coastal Commission, that these members of that commission seem to think that they are so almighty that they can stop a vital completion and jeopardize the security of our country. In other words, we've obviously, from 9/11 on, we knew that dangerous people are coming into this country legally and illegally, and these coastal commissioners don't know, you said before the program, don't know that we're at war.
Yeah.
They don't seem to understand we're
if you
at
look
war.
at the U.S. visit program, which is the current replacement for our, right after 9/11 we had our program, what the United States did is implement a situation where if you're an alien in this country, you had to report every year your location and your address, your telephone number, your employer, where you could be held, where you could be found. U.S. Visit has now changed that. That's the recent upgrade to that process where you biometrically get people's fingerprints and get their photograph, and as they come in and out of the country, you're able to identify who these people are. Well, right now, the problem we have is at the federal level, they say, well, Asa Hutchinson says, well, you don't have to do that for Mexicans and you don't have to do that for Canadians. So it's an unequal application of the law right now. And I don't know where that's going to go yet, but the problem is that if they implement U.S. Visit for people from Sri Lanka or wherever they come from, they should do it for Mexico and for Canada as well. And that's the only way we'll be able to test and find out if we, I mean, does this just mean that the future terrorists that come into the United States only can go through Canada or Mexico to get here? I don't understand that process, and I think we need to look at that pretty strongly.
Well, let's face it, we have to complete that war on international Islamic terrorism, and that's what it is, Islamic terrorism. We've frankly got to consider not all Muslims.
I think a lot of people don't admit that we're still in it.
Of the 1.2 billion Muslims, a high percentage would not speak out against Islamic leaders.
If you listen to John Kerry, he says that they really don't want to be at war with us, that we just kind of forced it on them.
Oh,
and,
yes.
And you know, the concept is that, you know, John Kerry would have you believe that, well, you know, these people, they just want to be our friends, and
Sure.
if we just didn't go to war with them or pick on them, that they would gently go away into the night.
Well, you know, Hitler could be saying the same thing. We don't want war with you if you'll only do what we are suggesting, you know. Come on. The point is, what we're talking about today is the impact that I think excessive immigration, we're taking in more people than all the other nations of the world combined, and that plus the illegal aliens that are coming in impoverished with a high birth rate. It's causing what I regard, and I've written on it for 30 years, demographic crisis. I call it a catastrophe. Crime, drugs, welfare, babies having babies, declining morality in all areas, declining academics as part of the sociological decline. One of the things I gave you said it's America's slide into the sewer. So it is affecting us tremendously in all of these areas, and I think we can continue to talk about the problem, and what you said is correct. We need solutions, and we're going to have to come up with viable solutions. Larry, let's get Larry in.
Well, the solution is attrition, and it's just a matter of enforcing the laws. We've got 500,000 illegals coming across San Diego and Arizona each and every year. We've got border guards down there that are supposed to be looking for terrorists. They're supposed to be looking for drugs that are being smuggled into this country. Again, they're not INS anymore. They've got a new name. That's
Call them INS.
It's a lot of border to cover without having the support of the federal government. The state has no power. We can't put our troops down there to protect ourselves, yet we're paying $4 or $5 billion a year to deal with the benefits and the cost of incarceration that you mentioned earlier. So it is a big problem, and I think our governor should be putting pressure on the White House and saying, hey, you know, you've got to do a better job of enforcement. Eventually, I would like to see a constitutional amendment to the 14th Amendment whereby anybody that comes into this country illegally, has a child in this country, there's no automatic that you become a citizen, because that's the inducement for them to come here. It isn't just jobs. We'll take care of them once you have that baby. And a lot of them, as you say, are the unfortunates that are not making, they're not the professionals, so a lot of them go on to welfare programs, and it's really draining our treasury. I mean, we've got a big enough financial problem as it is.
I got one question for you, Dr. Garber. You know, when you fly into any airport in the United States, what's the first thing that happens when you return from a foreign country? It says, American citizens, this line. Okay? Foreign citizens, this line. Why don't we have that same scenario set up on the border of California and every border crossing that we go to? Shouldn't we have two separate lines, one for U.S. citizens, one for day workers, perhaps from San Diego? They know how many day workers that go back and forth across the border there in California, and then one for why don't they do that?
I'd have to say that we haven't even touched on it. A good part of this, I think most would agree, happens to be political. It's the big vote, and as our demographics change in this country, we said multiculturalism, we're getting a change in our, let's say, what's the word for the voters out there? The
constituents.
Well, oh boy, slips my mind. In other words, the people that are voting today are quite different than the people that voted years ago in terms of the changing demographics.
Right.
And therefore, it's called the big vote. You have the politicians, Republicans or Democrats, want to appeal to the electorate. The electorate is changing out there. That's the word. And the politicians are, especially in states like California. So our new governor is aware of that, and that's why I think he is, let's say, negotiating with Cedillo now on this new version of the 1160 bill
right.
to give the illegals the right to vote, which is an outrage. If he does that, we'll start a recall of our new governor.
Well, I guess my question is a lot of the anti-immigrant groups, I call them anti-immigrant, that's maybe
Anti-illegal immigrants.
All right.
We're not
Anti-illegal immigrants. I don't understand why you don't demand that we close down our borders for a period of time to check it out, to see how we're doing.
I think a lot of people, including ACRU, is for a temporary moratorium, at least a temporary moratorium on all immigration until we get our accounting straight as to who's here and how many we should be getting in. But I think we have a very permissive immigration policy, both for legal and, it goes without saying, the illegal part is a law and order issue, and we're not, let's say, abiding by the law. But anyhow, we're going to be running out of time shortly, so let's have some final thoughts on this.
Well, I just believe that, you know, our immigration is an endemic part of, a systemic part of America. It's a constant influx of people coming to this country because they want freedom, they want opportunity, they want choices and jobs. They want to feed their families.
Billions
now,
around the world want that, so we let all of them
right.
in?
No, that's
How about let's take in all from Africa?
Let me finish my point here.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have immigration laws to serve us. They're not being followed. And I think that what we need to do is elect people that say, this is our immigration policy, and we decide on what that is. And then we actually follow through with it, and we find people that work for us, that's the Congress and the administration of this United States, that will actually follow through and say, that's what we're going to do, and we're actually going to follow our own immigration laws. As long as we kiss everybody's baby and say, hey, we don't care what our immigration laws are, you guys can do anything you want to do, we're never going to find a solution.
How about you, Larry? What do you
Well, I would think,
as a
you know,
final...
we have laws on the books, and we either enforce them or change them. It's easy to find fault and identify the problem. The harder part is the solution. And I believe that, you know, when the president says we're going to match a willing worker with a willing job, if these illegals were not coming into this country, if they had to wait in line like everybody else, then it may have put pressure on the employers to pay a better wage. And they would find as Americans that would be willing to do these jobs. So as long as you can bring people in, it's the same thing with outsourcing. We send manufacturing and software to Asia because it's a better price there. You can't outsource your agriculture. So the alternative is you bring these people in who are willing to work for less wages. And you, it's all about money.
You know,
at the end of the day, it's all about money.
The governor of Colorado, I think Lamb is his name, CCIR just last night sent out a lot of things, including his speech, a recent speech, how one destroys a nation. Very, very, I was going to bring it down this morning, but it's a long, long thing. And it includes some of what we were talking about, multiculturalism, bilingual, multilingual languages in the country, and then the idea of some groups, MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, even some of the more extreme groups, sure, which do not regard California as a legitimate state of the country, that it should be part of Mexico, that we took it unfairly, and they really are dedicated to taking back, in terms of their charter, taking back the South. The southwest part of this, Metch is another one, of this country, and we go along with that. You know, when it comes to the Middle East, and we know what Israel's been faced for 55 years, other, let's say, society, the Islamic Arabs wanting to have this part and this part, actually what they want is all of Israel. And these, oh, here we go, I hear the music. Ran out of time. Well, you've heard it, and you have an opportunity to get back to us, pro or con, on what you think. So Dr. Howard Garber here. Check our website. My email's up there, and we do appreciate your tuning in, and we appreciate hearing from you. Gentlemen? Dr. Howard Garber here for the ACRU. That's the American Civil Responsibilities Union. We're incorporated here in California. We've been on the scene a long time, and over a long period of time. We're approaching 8 years on Adelphia Cable TV. We've covered a lot of subjects, a lot of issues. Most often they're controversial issues, and we're going to continue on, let's say, that idea of hashing out controversial issues. Last week's program dealt with legal and illegal immigration and the implications for our country, and so today's program is kind of, because we did get into some of the aspects of morality and ethics because of that situation. And today's program, Morals and Ethics in Our Increasingly Decadent USA. And we have again with us Ron Winship. Ron, thank you for coming back again. And Ron, you're the producer of Cutting Edge. It's an internet interview program. And also Larry Gilbert. Thanks, Larry, for being on last week and continuing. You're a field reporter for Cutting Edge, and let me again give the website. It's www.cuttingedge-atalkshow.com. I'll repeat that, www.cuttingedge-atalkshow.com. I think it's on the screen, so check that one out. You know, before the program, we were considering a number of aspects of this problem that we call a declining morality in this country, and you were talking about the FCC and what, let's say, is permitted on the air today as opposed to what, let's say, our standards were 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So let's get into that, Larry. You start out.
Well, I would say that the Super Bowl, which was beamed all over the world, was an eye-opener for a lot of people who would normally be not necessarily watching, but they're watching the halftime performance, and the issue with Janet Jackson triggered something that's been long overdue, and that's a little bit of oversight which has been lacking by FCC, the airways which they regulate. And when you have sex and violence that our kids are exposed to, it only leads to things that happen downstream, where they get involved in crimes, and a lot of them are committed because of the things that they have seen. A lot of the sex and violence plays out for them in the schoolyards. We have a situation where we have Kobe Bryant right now, where we're downplaying what rape really means. You know, it's no big deal, is the way some people portray it. You know, this girl is promiscuous. You have to really peel the onion back to see what is the core that triggers all this. And I would say that if you look back for the past 10 years, the products that are coming out of Hollywood have a lot to do with the decay in this country. The kinds of programming that our kids watch on TV. I've read that the adult bookstores, there's 3 times as many adult bookstores in this country than there are McDonald's. I mean, this is something that we just can't and shouldn't be tolerating. So I would think that, and this is not a religious right-wing extreme issue. I think it's crossed over a broad spectrum of our population where people are upset. There were 240,000 complaints filed against the broadcast industry to the FCC last year, but there was no action taken. So we have, again, an agency that may have laws, but they're not enforcing those laws. They're increasing the penalties now, and I still don't think that's enough. It's a start, but it's not the answer.
I want you to respond to something, Ron. First, I indicated in last week's program that the INS, what was the INS and Border Patrol at that time, had failed over the years to do the job, and that caused the current problem we have of ever-increasing illegal immigration into the country. And I say to you that the FCC, in the minds of many, certainly I feel this way, the FCC also has failed in recent years to do the job of guarding the public, and I'll underline public airwaves. And let's deal with that, Ron.
Yeah, I think that you've got to look at the younger generation today, and they're all laughing at us older people for saying that, gee whiz, you want to hold back this, or you want to hold back porn, you want to hold back the 5 o'clock news. What do you want to hold back from children today? I mean, the problem is that every generation thinks that the prior generation, you know, is old hat. Starting with jazz in the 20s probably, and I didn't know much more before that. But you know, every generation thinks that, like in the 1920s, they thought jazz was the end of our times, that the moral decay of our whole society was soon at hand. And then after that, it was jitterbug music after World War II, and then it was Elvis, and then it was the Beatles, and then it was, you know, now it's Britney Spears or something. The problem is parenting. It has nothing to do with what kids are exposed to. The kids get exposed to I mean, when you watch the 5 o'clock news and you see Michael Jackson being a pedophile or accused of being a pedophile, what do you think the little 3 or 4-year-old children are going to ask their parents? Mommy, what's a pedophile? And somebody's got to do some tall explaining to them about that. So what we're saying is, what do you want the FCC to do? You know, and just from my own belief, obviously the Janet Jackson thing happened during a national event. That's the World Series. That's the, you know, anything that's got 43 million people watching it, or if you're going to watch the Academy Awards, it's up to 1 billion people now, I guess, or a national soccer match or something. Obviously, you'd like to take some control of that for the broader audience. But, I mean, you know, you look at the internet and all the pornography, that's the biggest selling thing that's on the internet is pornography. And you know that they're not old 18-year-old people that are willing consent. There are a lot of children that are watching internet pornography. It's a terrible thing. But, you know, we discussed this last week, as you said. What are the solutions to these things? And
well, wait a second. Before we get into solutions, I think we have to have some agreement as to what constitutes, let's say, reasonable standards in that area, and does the government or does the society have the right to, let's say, dictate reasonable standards?
Well,
I do not agree, but I do
York?
not agree, and I'd like you to comment. I do not agree with your analogy that changes, let's say, in music over the decades has even anything to do with obscenity and pornography. We're talking, wait a second, unless you're talking about lyrics that are obscene.
That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Well, but they thought that
Gene Vincent was the worst thing in the world.
In my view, you know, I play tenor guitar. I know a little bit about music, but
Bee-Bop-A-Lula was banned in 1956.
Bee-Bop-A-Lula is not Bee-Bop-A-Lula. It may be banned, but it's not pornography, and it's not obscene.
Some people thought it was.
Well, how can you say Bee-Bop-A-Lula is... No, it has nothing to do. The words itself, no. We know what pornography is. We know what obscenity is, and just nonsensical terms it doesn't... Do you agree?
Let me share with you. I think the Supreme Court has come down on this First Amendment issue of the freedom of speech, because it is seen by the kids. I think they're taking a harder look at it. I agree with you that we enjoy freedom of speech as the first freedom that was in our Constitution for the our Bill of Rights. But by the same token, I think it's been abused. We push the window. Hollywood continues to push the window, and the result is that we have so many sexual predators out there. You have kids going into chat rooms that meet with people. The technology is causing part of this problem as well.
But how do you roll that back?
I might have misunderstood you, Ron, but it seems to me that you were, in essence, in my view, saying that these changes that you described over the years were expected changes that we should adapt to. And then you related, I said, these earlier forms of music. And,
no, but they're unexpected changes. Let me explain this to you. You know, the best, one of our favorite movies was Last Boy Scout with Bruce Willis. And the guy's got him by the neck, and he's shaking him, and he says, "You want me to hurt you? You want me to hurt you?" And Bruce Willis turns around and says, "Yeah, you want to hurt me? Play some rap music." You know, I mean, the bottom line is that rap music is not my cup of tea or anybody else's that I know.
Rap music is a different kind of music. It doesn't have anything to do with sex or violence.
It certainly does.
If it does, well, if the lyrics
they tell them to cop kill and they do all these things.
Oh, well, then talk about that. Don't talk about just that music. Talk about the lyrics. If you're talking about lyrics that are violent, lyrics that are obscene, then deal with that. But you weren't talking about obscene lyrics. I'm talking melodies or beat or whatever it is.
No, you misread that.
Okay, the point is, this program goes by fast, and I don't want to get, let's say,
Dr. G, you and I used to watch Archie Bunker, and that was controversial at its time. Now the programs that are on TV, and you look at all the sex and the violence and homosexuals and, gay relationships, it's a moral swing, and it's a decay, I think, of our society.
Well, let me put it this way. It is my view, and I'd like you both to respond to it, that human beings are adaptable, and we consider human adaptation to be a benefit. And I say, and speaking for my organization, and the reason for the name of the organization, the key word responsibility, is that we have to balance, let's say, civil liberties that you're talking about, the right to speak out freely with civil responsibilities, the right to expect people to behave. Now, let's talk about human behavior. Does society, and I said this before the program, and does a nation have the right to impose reasonable community standards when it comes to conduct? And we're not even getting into the area of ethics here. We're it's not only morality, where it's led to the broken home syndrome. A good percentage of our population doesn't, let's say, isn't raised with two parents there to discipline and supervise and guide them in life. We have had the decay not only of the family unit, but we have these influences that you're talking about on TV, radio. You can't go to a movie today and expect that it would be appropriate for a kid. Back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, any, myself included, could go to any movie and they were G. Any movie was appropriate. Today, you'd have to research.
Yeah, but you didn't have Bill Clinton in those days either. I mean, we had this has happened from the top of the pay scale all the way down. I mean, when we had Bill Clinton in office, we had over a year and a half or 2 years of hearing about oral sex for children. I mean, now these are the things that, I mean,
it's been pervasive.
These are, there's called, they've used the word salacious content as a part of, it was the Democrats at the time were fighting, obviously, the impeachment, and said, well, they should use all this salacious content. Well, salacious content is part of our entire society, practically. So what do we do to change it? And that's all I'm saying to you.
But you mentioned before the program about youngsters not remembering this and not remembering that, because we, as let's say, shall I say senior citizens? At least this one is a senior citizen, remembers those better days when you could walk the streets in relative safety. You didn't have to worry about
pornography.
But the point is, I think most of us that have those memories will agree that when it comes to crime and drugs and gang warfare and expanding welfare and I would have to say promiscuity, babies that shouldn't be born, and the idea of declining morality in all of these areas and declining academics, and let's get into Enron and the corporations doing what they've done to steal as they've done from the public.
My point
is decadence. Go ahead.
No, my point is this. In that, when we had World War I, we had French postcards. Those were the most pornographic things that anyone had ever seen. The soldiers brought them back from France. In World War I, I mean, we're talking about all kinds of things that were pornography were going on since the earliest days of our history. It's the amount and the availability of it. How many French postcards got back to the United States? Probably not so many. But how many porn sites are there that are pornographic?
I may be way off base, but as a Korean War vet and remembering the World War II period, I remember pin-ups. They weren't pornographic, and most of the French postcards, and I was in France, that they would be selling around the Louvre and different places, were nude ladies. I'm not talking...
They've had prostitution there.
I'm not talking prostitution. I'm not talking nudity. I'm talking pornography.
Well, I'm talking pornography too.
Raw picture? I'm talking action photos.
You know what, G, let me come back to you, because you were talking about morals and ethics. And when our kids see the President of the United States getting indicted for what he did, when people get to see what happened in Enron,
you're
Martha
talking
Stewart,
Clinton.
Right. When you see all the things, what kind of examples are we leaving for our kids? You know, who are our leaders? Who are going to be their heroes when they see all the white-collar crime that's going on? I was on a trip last year to St. Petersburg, Russia, And the home that we were staying at, the first question that the host asked us, talk to me about what happened with Enron. So here I am, thousands of miles away from home, and the world is small, and people see and watch what we do in this country, and we are under a microscope, and we're not necessarily setting the best example for our kids. And our kids, we tell them one thing, we say practice, what we do, but then again, we don't necessarily set the right standard. We lower the bar.
The hottest thing in the hottest thing in the nation right now, and probably will be for some time to come, is gay marriage. I mean, my goodness gracious, the thought of a gay marriage in the 50s is unbelievable. But the bottom line is that there'll probably be some, in the final analysis, some accommodation will be made on gay marriage in this country.
You're talking same-sex marriage.
I'm talking same-sex marriage. Here's a mayor of San Francisco going out and without any support, just saying, yeah, we can go get married.
Violating the laws of the state of California with impunity. With impunity.
Exactly, but my point is that he's setting an example for people all across the nation.
Absolutely.
So you see what I'm saying? What I'm getting at is, can we just close our minds to it? No, we've got to open our minds to it. We've got to figure out solutions to those things. I'm going along with the governor on this when I'm saying, if there's a law in place, you can't break the law if you're a sitting, I don't care what part of city government, county government you are. You can't just go arbitrarily break a law, a state law, without having some repercussions.
You shouldn't be able to.
He should have been arrested or molested or whatever he was supposed to be whenever that was done. I mean, the bottom line is...
We have laws against illegal immigration. They're pouring over the borders.
Right.
We have the death penalty in California.
Right.
We've had 13 executions in 40 years.
Right.
We've had the de facto blockage. So the law often doesn't mean a damn thing when it's not enforced. And when it comes to the subject you're talking about, gay marriages, it's not only in California and in Massachusetts.
No,
now it's popping up all over. So the point, I think, if you want to explore those areas, we're beginning to adapt to some of these things like it's inevitable. And we're beginning to, let's say, treat these individuals as if they are deserving of being called a separate. What's the group that I'm thinking?
Well, here's the point on.
In other words,
why should I have to admit? Why should I have to agree to it? Just because they want it.
No,
why do I have to agree to it?
They want special civil rights. And
That's
let's
what I'm
face
saying.
it. What is the basis for these gay marriages? The basis of it is you have persons that are abnormal, statistically abnormal, whether it's psychological or physiological or a combination of ways. They are a statistical abnormality, and they've united, and they are a very small percentage of the total population, and yet they want to be treated like any other ethnic, racial, religious, or nationalistic group. They don't deserve that kind of consideration as far as I'm concerned. I am not anti-homosexual. I understand they have a problem. It's an unfortunate problem.
They just want the tax break.
For them to unite and demand certain special rights, such as marriage, which by law has always been, let's say, something that was, let's say, for same, a man and a woman under this contract that's, let's say, I guess you'd call it a government contract, and they want that same right. They are not deserving of that right.
Well, the bottom line is, I mean, the next thing the guy's going to marry his dog, or someone's going to marry 4 people, or whatever. All these different issues that come into play on this.
How about 2 12-year-olds marrying?
Not exactly, and that probably is okay in Mississippi.
Well, all right, don't we?
My point is,
saying, yeah, I'm with you on it. And don't we prescribe against polygamy?
Yeah,
all right.
But my point is that they're just laws, okay?
Yeah, but do we have a right to set up these laws to prescribe certain kinds?
No, my point is, I don't. I think that the people should vote on those laws. And what you said was about community standards. I want to hit back on that for 1 second, because the community standards in New York may be a whole lot different than they are in Arizona. And as a result, community standards are kind of a fluid thing. You may be able to watch certain movies in New York City that you cannot watch in Arizona. You may be able to go to certain bookstores and read certain types of books in New York City that you can't read in Arizona. So, those are all community standards. And so once the federal government steps into the fray of claiming what a community standard is, I'm kind of leery about that.
Well,
because it's going to take
I think
a lot of different
the
people.
First Amendment, though,
Yeah.
would come into question here when it comes to something you can't read in New York that you can read in California. That I don't think would pass the Supreme Court.
Well, you know, that's where I'm going. When the federal government sets a community standard, it's for the whole thing.
No, but when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of the press, that's one area. But I'm a states' rights guy, and I believe that different states can have different standards when it comes to whether it's gambling or and.
So do you think that there should be, you know, the gays and lesbians wanted to start their own state? They wanted to go to their own state and actually have a gay and lesbian state.
Let them do that. That's okay, but in a different country. Find that land out there. You know,
No,
we already have a defined country here.
I think they wanted Wyoming or Montana.
No, they can't have one of our states. Let's say, resolve that in the Civil War, but let them go out of the country someplace if they want a new colony. That's fine
when you say moral decay, if you ask any mom or dad that sends their kids to school, what are they going to say about their children? They're going to say, well, I'm doing the best I can raising my children and giving them good moral values.
Yeah, but we said that
when they go to school, they get all of these weird values because they're listening to other kids that have other parents. And as a result of that fact...
Well, wait a second. A good percentage of the kids don't have parents. We went through that already.
Dr. Garber, the problem is we live in a throwaway society. People get married, they don't stick to that commitment. And then you have latchkey kids
Escalating divorces, the broken home syndrome, so a lot of the kids you're talking about don't have the discipline, the supervision, and the guidance of parents. So there's a lot of reasons for this decay that we're talking about. But basically, getting down to the so-called nitty-gritty, what is natural and normal, your naked body, there's nothing wrong with the naked body, not walking down my street, okay? In other words, we are, if you want to say, human animals, but we modify our conduct. So we don't, let's say, go along with all the conduct that other animals, let's say, are engaged in freely. They have maximum freedom, including freedom to kill one another. You know, I don't want the kind of society where I'm free to do anything, or people are free to do anything they damn well please. Sex is perfectly normal. I've said it a million times. Everyone knows that sex is perfectly normal. Not in our public parks. Not on my front lawn. So let's face it, just because something is physiologically...
You didn't live through the 70s, huh?
Well, let's go back to the 60s, the so-called love generation. The point is, I believe, and I'd like your answers or your comments, I believe that society, and I believe the state, like California, or the nation, has a right to impose reasonable community standards. And people ask, what kind of reasonable standards? And I say, well, whether you're religious or not, I talk about the Judeo-Christian ethic or the Judeo-Christian morality.
We'd all like to see that, but that's almost an impossibility. What we should be getting is more control of our cable companies to say, this is what I want to see, more selectivity there. It shouldn't be, you just shouldn't get all, when you sign up for your cable company, you shouldn't get all the cable companies with all the different things. You should be able to pick your own choice of cable
through government.
No, from your
You mean an individual's going to go to the cable company and say, no, I don't want you to do that?
You can get the new V-chip. There are ways that you can block access to some of the programming. That's
what I'm saying is that you should have an opportunity when your cable provider comes up with stuff. They should say, well, do you want these channels or these channels? And you get your choices. And if you don't want channels that are like Cinemax and those kinds of channels that have sex on them every 11 o'clock at night all the time, then you don't choose them.
I think one major thing here, especially concerning children, is that if you can't provide two parents when at all possible, you can't prevent deaths, you can't prevent divorce, but when you can't provide two parents, a man and a woman, to raise the children, that's one requirement. Children entering this world should have that right to two parents. Children entering this world should have at least minimal let's say, financial circumstances, a roof over their head, clothes, and food. If you can't provide the basics for children, you should not have them coming into the world. And I don't mean by welfare. I'm not talking about a person on welfare. Individuals on welfare, by definition, can't afford these children. They're saying, we're going to have these children, and you're going to pay for it. That's absurd, and permissive society goes along with that. And the third thing has to do with, let's say, the discipline and supervision we're talking about. You could be a millionaire, and if you can't provide for the guardianship, the supervision and discipline, because you're in Washington or in Hollywood and your kids are, and you're affluent and your kids are there on drugs and everything else, you're not supervising your kid. Those are the three basic requirements. The right to two parents and the supervision and discipline.
The only way that happens is we can't outsource any more jobs. That means we've got to support our middle class and small business communities.
But the thrust of that is that when kids come into the world without these three requirements...
We agree, but the point is that the only way you're going to provide those things to anyone is through either having jobs not be outsourced to foreign countries, two, that small business should be encouraged and helped along the way, and three, that we get more of those people together in one group. Right now, by separating small businesses out and people that don't have jobs now that used to have jobs, I mean, you've created a situation where you have latchkey kids.
Before the program's over, let's get down to some of the considerations there. Let's face it. Third worldism we haven't even touched on, because we're talking about America, but on a third world basis, when we're talking about poverty and we're talking about the decline of, let's say, certain societies, you got to face up to it. Italy will lose 28% of its population. At the very same time, the Congo increases 227%. I'm talking about the Congo with endemic pathology, AIDS, hepatitis, tuberculosis, sleeping sickness. One of the highest infant mortality rate on the continent. And despite all of that, it's going to be, and these are not my figures, United Nations figures, it's going to be increasing to 227%.
Exactly.
Our own country, our internal third world, the so-called disadvantaged, they are having all of the kids. I mean,
well, of
most
course,
of them.
Because the more intelligent societies have less children. We all know that.
All right.
Starting with Sweden and all the way down.
Well, Larry, what's the ultimate conclusion then? He acknowledges it. What's the ultimate conclusion?
Let me shift gears and throw it back to you. I just read that the No Child Left Behind law, part of the president's program is being watered down now because of compliance. And it goes back to your issue. When you don't have a solid family unit where there's parents that both sit there with the kids and make sure they're doing the homework and go to these PTA meetings, when the kid's allowed to roam the streets and get into trouble, of course we're going to have a 30% dropout out of schools.
Graffiti, gang warfare.
These are all products of a declining society that we live in.
And we're adapting to this miserable situation, as if it's inevitable. It's unfortunate, and it looks like we're almost at the end of the program. The final comment?
I think that, there's an overreaction and then there's a correct action. And obviously, a lot of things that offend us because we're from a different generation than the next generation, we have to sort of sit back and look at that and say, how really offensive is rock and roll music, or how really offensive is...
The lyrics. Let's talk lyrics.
I know, but having said that, there are a lot of things in our society that are obnoxious. Bernie Ebbers and Ken Lay and Jeffrey Skillings and Martha Stewart. These people are very offensive to me.
Make them pay for it financially. You put them in jail and it costs more money. I'd rather have them
Those would be worth putting in jail for. Those are ones...
You've heard it. You've heard it. Dr. Howard Garber for the ACRU. If you are pro or con what you heard, please get in touch with us. You've got our website, our email. Thank you for tuning in, gentlemen.
Thanks so much, Dr. D.
I thought we'd cover a lot. Dr. Howard Garber here for the ACRU. This morning we're going to be discussing a highly controversial subject right off our schedule. It reads, Radical Islam's War on Western Democracy and Judeo-Christian Morality. For those of you that tune in weekly, and we're in our 6th year on Adelphia Cable TV, you know that we explore all kinds of societal issues and controversial subjects. And our last program was on educational issues, and we got into other areas like Prop 209 dealing with illegal immigration. Today we're going to deal with what I consider probably the most serious problem that our Western democracies in the U.S. are facing, and we're going to deal with radical Islam, and we have another panel here. We have Bruce Crawford. You're back again, Bruce. Appreciate you coming down. And Carl Perlston. You've been on before, Carl?
Sure.
Carl is, I guess, semi-retired from law. You've been in
Yes, semi-retired.
a legal practitioner for a number of years.
Yeah, I do arbitrations and mediations, alternate dispute resolution.
I see. And you are also very involved, I think, in terms of dealing with issues. You're involved as an interested, I'd call you a political activist. Do you mind that designation?
No.
Well, for that matter, both of you are, as I think all Americans should be. You should be involved in our political system. Let's get right to it, though. I got a very, I thought, interesting letter to the editor that you had submitted to the Orange County Register in response to Stephen Greenhut's article, which was headed The Roots of Radical Islam, a long article that continued. Radical Islam is a recent phenomenon. So let's start with you, Bruce. In essence, what were you referring to in your particular letter? And let's get right into what I said I regard as the menace to the free world.
Well, the radical Islam phenomenon is a fairly recent thing, but we have to deal with it. But Islam's not always been that way. And I'd like to get back to that later in the program if we have time. But the radical Islam that we're dealing with today is basically an immoral event. They're using children, they're using terrorists to attack completely innocent people, people who have never caused them any harm. And their victims include men, women, and children. This kind of evil has happened in Western civilization in times past, most notably Hitler, also Stalin. But one of the things that's differentiated the Judeo-Christian religions, I think, from what we're seeing in the modern radical Islam is that the clergy of the Judeo-Christian faiths have stood up to these kinds of evil and have been effective in turning the tide. An example under the Hitler regime was the Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had opposed Hitler's evil. And Bonhoeffer, like a lot of Germans, fled to the United States. But he decided, to put it in our terms, that he may be talking the talk, but he wasn't walking the walk. So a few weeks later, he returned to Germany and continued to oppose Hitler and his evil. For that, he was hanged. We don't see in modern Islamist community clergy speaking out in a moral way like this. They're not taking a moral authority, if you will. So to me, it is a crossroads for the Islamists into whether they want to be considered as a religion or as a cult. Cults have no moral authority. They have belief systems, but they have no moral authority. And so it is, I think, a time for them to do some self-examination. There is one example right now in Iran. I had originally thought the individual involved was a professor, but apparently it turns out he's also a member of the clergy. He is currently in jail facing a death sentence for having taken a moral stand in Iran.
You're referring to Iran.
Yes.
Okay.
having taken a moral stand against the Islamist theocracy there and its radical fundamentalist ideas. But we need to see more of that if they want to be considered a religion.
Well, I want to go to you, but I'll say in response to, let's say, what some individuals believe that in terms of 9/11, that things really, woke us up at 9/11, that we should have, I think, as a nation and as a free world, been far more concerned about not the threat, but the menace of Islam in so many different ways, even before 1993, when these Muslims, these radical, I would say, homicidal, as you put it, or murderous Muslims attempted to blow up the World Trade Center at that time. And between 1993, we had to wait, and then, of course, there were other things that happened. The American embassies that were blown up, and, of course, after 9/11, we had the coal incident. But it's been an ongoing thing, and it didn't start with 9/11, is my point. But, Carl, what are your thoughts about, let's say, a number of the things that he mentioned, including the fact that, historically speaking, Islam didn't represent that kind of, let's say, religion or...
Well, I would disagree that Islam hasn't represented that type of religion. Islam, from its inception, was born from a warrior viewpoint of imposing the religion on people who weren't ready to accept it. You just have to look at the historical record of how Islam was spread all across North Africa, into the Middle East, into Asia. It was always spread through war and conquering. There has been so much effort being spent on telling us how peaceful Islam is and how the great mass of Muslims are peaceful and seek to do nothing more than live a just and proper life. And I don't disagree with that. I'm sure that most people in the world, whether they are Islamic or whether they're Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or pagan or whatever, they have a desire to live a fruitful life. But there is a percentage of people, and some people think it's as high as 15%. I think Daniel Pipe says 15%. Well, that's 165 million Muslims out of a total population of 1.2 billion, who are of an extremist variety, who are intent upon making sure that the world corresponds to their worldview, not that their worldview in any way accommodates the world. And that means forcing the rest of the world to accommodate the way they think the world should be organized, which is in line with the Sharia, the law of the Quran. And we see that embedded in the Taliban regime, which we've just fought in Afghanistan, the regime in Sudan, it's coming up in Nigeria. The Sharia forms the basis of the constitutional law of most of the Middle Eastern countries. Saudi Arabia utilizes it, and I'm sure if there's going to be a Palestinian state, we may very well see the Sharia part of that. Tonight we have a television show on PBS.
Excuse me, there is a Palestinian state. It's called Jordan. But go ahead. And I insist on injecting that every time I hear that.
Right. Tonight there's a television show being shown on PBS, a 2-hour documentary on Muhammad. It's supposed to show us the truth about Islam. And what it is, it's a whitewash. There's no dissenting voices. There is no opposition. There are no disparate viewpoints. All we have in this program are going to be people telling us about how wonderful Muhammad was, about how wonderful Islam is as a faith, how it permits people to achieve their true potential. We're having all kinds of people from the United States being featured in this as to what a wonderful faith Islam is. Islam is the most rapidly growing faith in the world, and especially in the United States. You walk into a bookstore today and you look at the shelves in the religion section, and the number of books about Islam, and you look at these books, and what they seek to show you is how good and how peaceful Islam is. There is very little being shown as to the extremist nature, the deadly opposition to Western civilization that is in Islam. The mosques in the United States are largely funded by Saudi Arabia from the Wahhabi viewpoint, which preach estrangement from Western values, estrangement from Western society, estrangement from Western civilization. You remember the program that was done on 60 Minutes, and they went into some of the Muslim religious schools, and little children were saying, "Oh, I'm a Muslim. I'm not an American. I don't think of myself, as American. I'm a Muslim." What we have,
it's interesting that you bring that up. I just want to inject that in today's paper, the front page of the Register, they break down the national, international news. It made the same essential statement in a survey. None of Mexicans that have come here that don't regard themselves as Americans, but they regard themselves as part of their.
Right. Well, that's one of the things.
Front page of, so sure. In a similar way. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that's a different subject. But,
it is,
but certainly when you have Flag Day, which used to be an opportunity for kids to demonstrate with the American flag and teach about the history of the American flag and the values of American society. Flag Day now is where all the kids come in with the flags from the countries that they came from, and they talk about their flag. And you had in the Olympic Games, Mexicans in Los Angeles cheering the Mexican team instead of the American team and booing the American team.
That's an outrage. But
that's another whole subject.
Carl, you and Bruce, and I've been listening for this, and everything you've said so far have not, I don't think you have mentioned the term totalitarianism. In everything you said, let me just say that as I see it, and again, I like to deal with things on a general basis, I see this as, you could describe it in many ways, but the menace, the threat that we're talking about, as democracy versus totalitarianism. Of course, we've had that in World War II as well, but you mentioned the 1.2 billion Muslims in the world and growing, okay? And then you mentioned a much smaller number of those that you would regard, or that I think the world regards as the radical elements of Islam. I'd have to say that from my reading and from my observations, that of the 1.2 billion, you don't have too many that would come on a program like this and express their outrage over what we've been describing here and why. In fact, I'd have to venture to say that probably the great majority of them have no great interest or are not greatly outraged by Islam exploding as it is, and also the fact that they are part of an aggressive totalitarian worldwide system. What are your thoughts there?
I'd like to get back to those thoughts after I respond to a couple of things Carl said.
You're not going to respond to that?
I am.
Go ahead.
But no, the things that Carl is talking about are real, but they're pretty much a 20th century phenomenon. And when he's talking about the bookstores being full of the books, I don't think it's any trend towards people being attracted to it so much as that our lives have been changed as a result of people who practice that religion. So they want to know more about it because we're pretty much ignorant of it. Unfortunately, as Carl indicated with the PBS program that's going to be aired, most of the books that are available in the mainstream bookstores don't give you an accurate picture. They give you a very, as he called it, whitewash view. But it didn't start out that way. In the beginning, I'm going to read one little message from the Quran, the 19th Surah. Use no violence in religion. Fight for the religion of God against those who fight against you, but transgress not by attacking them first. The Quran is full of contradictory statements.
Absolutely.
We've heard a lot recently of other statements that are interpreted to encourage them to take militant action, to not proselytize, but coerce people to join their religion or die. So the radical element takes the ones that suit their motives and disregard the ones that are in direct opposition. One of the things that's interesting is that during the Crusades, when Pope Urban sent the barons and all their soldiers down to Mesopotamia, when they got there, they were totally surprised. They found the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians all living amongst each other, and maybe not in a chummy relationship, but in a tolerant relationship. They were doing business with each other, and they lived and worked together. That astonished them. That didn't stop them from going on and slaying.
Well, I've got the signal, we're over half over, but very frankly, on a personal basis, and not speaking for ACRU, I'd have to say that I'm less concerned about historical happenings than I am of what's happening today. Whatever Islam was, they could have been the most perfect religion way back, and I tend to agree with Carl that wasn't the case.
Now I want to get to respond to what you asked me. The other thing that is completely different from 20th and now 21st century Islam and the early Islam is that in the beginning it was a rejection of the authority of the Roman Church. It was pretty much a free state. It's only been within the 20th century that they've taken, actually I shouldn't say that, more the 16th century, when the world of the Saracens, as the Europeans call them, started to unravel because they didn't have political and legal systems that were viable, and it started to unravel and collapse. They had all this malaise. They were being pushed back out of Europe. Yeah. Their world was falling apart. They became more authoritarian.
Well, if you don't mind, let's stick with the 20th century and our current.
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. We have people like Jimmy Carter to blame for all this mess. Carter, who recently received the Nobel Peace Prize.
Wasn't that
it's a farce.
A great happening.
It completely delegitimized the Nobel Peace. But it was Carter and his national security advisor, Zabrinsky, who decided to give weapons to the radical Muslims in Chechnya to fight the Russians back in the late 70s.
I would regard his...
If you want to indict Jimmy Carter, go back to the support of the Shah of Iran and jerking the rug from under the Shah, who was the only bulwark of stability in the Middle East.
Right.
And we forced the Shah of Iran to allow Khomeini to come back.
Good point. Right.
Right.
So,
but in reference to his getting this Nobel Prize, it reminds me of Yasser Arafat getting a Peace Prize. So I think the Nobel Prize, the people involved in, let's say, those selections have damaged the reputation of the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know what your thoughts are, and I don't want to get into that. But again, let's talk about nations that have, like in World War II, Nazi Germany, also the Soviet Union from the time of the end of World War II, the Cold War, so to speak, going back to where the Russia that my folks came from, the Tsarist Russia, which was a totalitarian system. I don't think, and I could be wrong, that many regarded the Tsar as being a threat to the whole world. On the other hand, that totalitarian system under Stalin and other Soviet dictators did represent, I believe, a menace to the free world, and we successfully, let's say, ended that. But I think Islam, many individuals would agree that Islam represents even a greater threat by virtue of its, not only its sheer numbers, but there's not a single Islamic state. I know you in the past have brought up Turkey being a secular state, but you know, even the government there has changed, and they're going toward, let's say, Islamic ways. So I'm merely saying I think we ought to concentrate on the awful threat of this exploding totalitarian menace, not only in terms of what it represents in terms of its ideology, but in terms of its sheer numbers. As I'll end with this, and I want your retort. Ho Chi Minh, I keep saying, said he could lose during the Vietnam War 10 for every one of our soldiers. Islam can do far better than that. They can lose millions and millions and millions. We cannot.
And that's the ultimate threat
and not
to
only
Israel.
That,
they cannot fight a war of attrition.
One other thing, and don't forget how we misjudged Islam when we were on the side of Islam in fighting against the Soviet Union when in Afghanistan, and frankly we gave a lot of aid and comfort to today's enemy. Go ahead. What is your...
But going back to Russia, I'd like to draw a parallel, if I may, to what we're seeing today. What happened with Lenin and Stalin and their totalitarian state? They knew that it could not exist as long as the churches existed. They declared it an atheistic society. They persecuted Russian Orthodox and Jewish clergy. We're not, in a sense, we're seeing some of the same things right now in the radical Islam, and that there is no moral authority. The clergy aren't speaking out. They're not being persecuted, but if they do, they are, as we see with this one.
But you're ignoring the clergy that support the view of radical Islam.
No, but that's my point, is that the clergy cannot support radical Islam because there is no moral authority to do so, and that's why it's in jeopardy as religion.
I think what he's saying is that religion has a monopoly on morality. How do you respond to that?
When you go back to totalitarianism in Russia, the church was eliminated because it was a countervailing force of power, a countervailing agent to the government. A totalitarian system is one that imposes a total control over all aspects of life. Absolutely. In the name of a guiding philosophy or a guiding ideology or a guiding religion. Islam is such a totalitarian system that does not separate different areas of power. You cannot have, for example, in Nazi Germany, you couldn't have the Boy Scouts, you had the Hitler Youth. You couldn't have a church. Hitler tried to create his own religion.
Exactly.
In Russia, you couldn't have the Salvation Army. You have an agent of the Communist Party to do it. Under Islam, it tries to be a totalitarian system to perpetuate its worldview. Islam is not a tolerant religion. One of the great beauties of Western civilization was this concept of separation of church and state. That's one of the hallmarks of modern Western society.
The pilgrims, largely, they came here for that reason.
Once you have a theocracy, you allow for this totalitarian control in the name of the religious viewpoint, not necessarily a political viewpoint, but it all amounts to a totalitarian control of society. Islam has never had its reformation. Islam has never had its separation of church and state. As a consequence, the radical Islamists are merely doing what the rest of Islam says is to be done. Everything must be in the name of the Islamic State. Everything must be done to achieve the viewpoint, the goal of the Islamic State, which is a totalitarian control over all of life.
Well, James Q. Wilson, probably one of the preeminent social thinkers of our time, has written on basically the same subject, and he attributes the rise of Western civilization in the modern era to the ability to be able to balance freedom and religion. And he sees the problems in the Islamist world is that they cannot. Freedom has been quashed, completely eradicated in the advancement of their, quote, religion.
Well, I'll have to remind the audience, and I remind you, that during World War II, we were at war with a Protestant and somewhat Catholic Germany, certainly a Catholic Italy, Shintoistic Japan for the most part. We were involved in a war for our survival against, quote, religious nations. And I'll have to, and maybe we could do another program on this, but again, I do not think that religion has a monopoly on morality, and the point is, if Islam wants to call itself a religious movement, they can call themselves whatever they are. I call them a menace to the free world. They are an aggressive... Let me also add, and respond to this because we're running out of time. We've had programs in the past that touched on this. We've had programs dealing... I had a PhD on who was very involved in the Yugoslavian situation. He was an expert on Kosovo, and there's an analogy here too, dealing with California, the changing California because of our uncontrolled borders. He said, among other things, that Serbian Christians controlled that territory, Kosovo, for centuries until the Turks invaded. The point is, over the late period, they were a permissive territory, Christian Serbian territory, where they permitted legal and illegal immigration of Albanians. You read the newspapers, they don't say Islamic or Muslim Albanians. That's what they should, because the great percentage of the Albanians are Muslims, okay? So anyhow, they came in legally and illegally, and then actually, in a sense, it was ethnic cleansing of the Christian Serbs. And what did Clinton call it? He called it just the opposite. And when Milosevic, it's like the governor of California finally is putting down his foot and saying, no more illegal immigration, and the ones that are here illegally, out, and do whatever's necessary, you know, do that kind of thing. Would that be ethnic cleansing of the illegal? Sure, that's what Clinton would have called it. The point I am making...
What does that got to do with radicalism?
It has to do with the whole Yugoslavia as an example of aggressive Islam. They're taking over Montenegro. They're taking over, as far as I'm concerned, Macedonia. They'll get into northern Greece.
But are they doing that from a point of view of radical Islam?
Yes.
Or are they doing it from a nationalistic Albanian point of view?
They are doing it with the idea of being an aggressive people, 1.2 billion and growing, of taken over everywhere. Even the once great USA.
Howard, I think you've got to separate between nationalism, the Albanians having a desire for greater Albania, and making
Albanians. We're talking about Islam. They are Muslims.
What do they think of themselves
as? Chechnya. I read about Chechnya, and they never once refer to Islamic or Muslim Chechens, okay? That's what they are. They're allied with the rest of the Islamic world. Don't give me that. I don't know why the newspapers are so reluctant to use the term Muslim or Islam when they're talking about these separatist groups. You know, you talk about Yemen, for God's sake. Here we permitted the ship that was stopped by the Spaniards, I mean the Spanish vessel, and permitted it to continue on to Yemen because Yemen has a right to have these scuds. I'm sorry, I heard a signal. Go ahead, respond to some of what I'm talking about.
Okay. There are parallels in my mind between
final thoughts.
Shintoism and the radical Islamism. But I don't think that we need to look with a jaundiced eye at all Muslims living in America. My neighbor is Muslim. He's as American as apple pie.
I don't deal with individuals. I deal with the huge movement that we're describing.
I just want to say that when we're dealing with the problems of modern fundamental Islamists, that we don't need to throw...
Will he get on this program and invite him on? We'll do this in January.
I'll ask him, but it's just like saying all Southerners didn't belong to KKK.
Okay, final thoughts.
I think it's a mistake to mix the nationalistic strain of seeking geographic expansion of a particular nation with the global Islamic, radical Islamic threat to Western society and Western democracy. We only have a few minutes, but Islam needs a separation of church and state. Islam needs its own reformation to get rid of trying to impose its worldview on the rest of society.
You've heard it. Dr. Howard Garber, we've run out of time. Thank you for tuning in. Anyhow,